guys, welcome to Hawks Angeles. This week's going to be a little bit different. I don't have a guest on today, but I did want to talk a little bit about Dahmer Monster. The Jeffrey Dahmer story is, I guess, what it's called on Netflix, but essentially the new Netflix series on Jeffrey Dahmer. I just finished it about a week ago, got some thoughts on it, wanted to kind of share it with everyone. Didn't really have anyone on hand to talk about it with, so figured I'd start practicing doing my podcast on my own. But if you haven't heard, the show was released on Netflix in September. It stars Evan Peters, Richard Jenkins, Molly Ringwald, Nacy Nash, and Michael Learned. And it explores the motives of Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. So listen, I wasn't very clued in on Jeffrey Dahmer beforehand. It's a pretty gruesome, pretty sinister story that I think the Netflix series unpacks well. I mean, I've got some opinions on how they did that, but for the most part, I think it covers what happened fairly well in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the early 90s. So, if you're not familiar, Dahmer was kind of famous for being a cannibal and killing 17 men between the years of, I believe, 1981 and 1991. I might have those years wrong, but the story kind of goes in Netflix across 10 episodes, and it's pretty gruesome, man. The show opens with the actual attack that got Dahmer caught. If you're not familiar, he would pick up gay men at local gay clubs, bring them back to his house, and drug them. Do what he was known for, and eventually it would result in him eating the corpses of his victims. So it's pretty sinister stuff, man. It's really gruesome, and the Netflix show really spares no details. Literally doesn't let any details go to waste. It really shows you it in all its gory wonder. So the reason I wanted to talk about it today is there is a little bit of backlash, right? A lot of the families whose family members were victims to Jeffrey Dahmer in the early 90s weren't really ready for this. They didn't sign off on anything like this. So to have a horror story reach the heights that this show has, kind of bring that right back in the forefront, that's pretty tough for a lot of these people, right? The series rose to the #1 spot on Netflix within the first week of its release, and I think as of now, it's the 9th most popular English language TV show on Netflix of all time. So roughly 56 million households have viewed all 10 episodes. And I'll just kind of break into it. The show, as I already mentioned, opens with the victim who eventually brought Dahmer to justice. He was able to get away after Dahmer attempted to drug him, and then flagged down local police. When police came in to get a key to the handcuffs that Dahmer had put on Tracy Edwards, is the name of the potential victim here. Then they found evidence, and in the TV show, it's pictures of his other victims, of their decapitated bodies, and they eventually arrested him and went from there. So the story starts on that in Netflix, but it kind of goes back to the systemic failures, right? Dahmer was clearly a troubled kid, had a lot of issues at home. Seems like there were plenty of warning signs. Whether or not those were heeded is another question. But I think, frankly, as someone who just watched the series, didn't have a ton of information on Jeffrey Dahmer, this all kind of happened before I was born, so I really didn't hear much about it. Maybe just random references in pop culture here and there. I kind of just wish I watched a documentary, man. As well acted and artsy as I think the directors and the show creators got, because it is a well shot, well paced, well written series. I don't know, man. It kind of gives you a real icky feeling to see it feel, I don't know, almost have a story that is exploiting a horrible, horrible tragedy on so many levels. I mean, so many people lost their lives. And I think in areas where they were depicting what actually happened, because from all the research I've done, the show is pretty accurate, right? It really lays out kind of specific incidents with different victims of his, including his first and his, last. And the most notorious one was he took a 14-year-old boy whom he had already had history with the family, and even though his neighbor kind of identified that something was up, police kind of turned a blind eye because of his sexuality and the situation, and there were some racial elements involved as well. It resulted in a really, really bad tragedy, and from everything I've read and looked into, it all is pretty accurate based on the brief research I've done. And that's kind of my point. Is I feel like I could have gotten the story a lot sooner, a lot quicker if I had just watched a documentary, read into it a little more, and wouldn't have been as disturbing. Now, on one hand, that could be pretty powerful, right? I'm sure the producers knew what they were getting at in time, but I couldn't help but think that we're cementing the legacy of a pretty terrible person who did some pretty radical things. And I think there's a reason we haven't seen this kind of done before, right? Like, Netflix has started to move into this territory where they're dramatizing serial killers. I know they had one on Ted Bundy. I believe there's one coming on John Wayne Gacy. I might be wrong on that, but I don't think this is the right way to handle these stories. I don't think it's necessarily preventative, right? I think it's kind of gross, actually. I think it's important we remember the victims, and I think that's a message that a lot of people try to bring up more and more, right? We want to talk about the victims and not mention the attacker, the serial killer, the shooter, what have you, as much, right? We don't want to glorify it or even be mistakenly glorifying it just by giving it attention. But the show is called Dahmer hyphen monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. It's not called the 17 victims or what have you. Keep in mind, 17 is just the victim number that we think we know. Could have been more. Although I would say, unlike John Wayne Gacy's story, which has a lot more mystery around it, I would say that Jeffrey Dahmer seemed to have been pretty forthright in admitting and talking about all of his victims, as well as, if you watch the show, you'll learn he kept the driver's licenses of most of his victims as almost a souvenir, if you will. Now, some of the backlashes around the things we've talked about already. There were some highlights across the show. I think all the actors really did a phenomenal job. Evan Peters, who we already knew could be really creepy from American Horror Story, as well as some other roles he's done, is absolutely just totally disturbing as Jeffrey Dahmer. He looks a lot like him based on pictures I'm looking at, and nails that kind of Midwest Wisconsin accent to a T. But I think the stylized nature of the show, like, clearly they worked so hard to kind of deliver, a certain feeling, a certain atmosphere, ideas about his social equity and the way he kind of was brought up, and some of the failures around police not being able to catch him or family life not supporting him the way he was. That's all well and good. I just can't help but think that this isn't the right way to go about it. So, I don't want to spend a ton of time today on today's podcast on this. I really just wanted to get some thoughts out there because it really is a hot topic for everything. But overall, just wanted to kind of get that going. So, if you're in the mood for something really spooky, sure, give it a shot. But I think overall, I'd probably recommend check out a documentary instead. You'll learn the same things about the Dahmer story, and I don't think you'll be supporting something that feels just kind of grossly exploitative of the whole situation, right? Um, Now, while I want to give it some credit, besides just the actors, I think it does a really good job of telling the Glenda Cleveland story. So I didn't know a ton about this, but I mean, I didn't know about the story at large, but allegedly one of the biggest problems with the whole process was that Glenda Cleveland was Jeff Dahmer's next door neighbor, who was just so beside herself the entire time she lived next door because she realized very quickly something was up with him. She knew something was going on. She, among the rest of the apartment, could smell that he was doing some horrible things. She reported him to the police at least once, maybe multiple times. Reported them to the property managers, to the landlord, so on and so forth, and was not heard because, more likely than not, because she, among the rest of the tenants of the building, were African American or lower income or what have you, and were just frankly ignored. So there's a big piece of it that speaks to that, justice system failure, and I think that's great. I think the stuff in court is really great. Um, One of the victims, actually two of the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, were from a family from Laos, and this immigrant family was kind of not respected the same way probably a white family would have been back in the early 90s, late 80s, and as a result, Dahmer gets a real slap on the wrist for child molestation, and that's what led him to be able to take so many more victims' lives, and it's really disgusting. um, but I do think the show does a good job to kind of say that. Now, my main criticism is I just don't think the show needed to be 10 episodes long. I wouldn't say it ever really like drags or anything. I think, it definitely gives a lot of time and importance to the full story, but I don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of a total monster serial killer's lifestyle. We don't do dramatized versions of really, really awful like political figures, at least not based entirely around them from like a biopic standpoint, right? Sure, there might be an actor that plays Stalin in a movie, but as far as I know, there isn't a movie that dramatizes his life and tries to make him sympathetic at any point. And whether the Netflix show wants to admit it or not, I think there's a lot of points where um, it's implicitly trying to make you sympathetic to Dahmer's childhood, especially when he's abandoned by both his mother and father for a long time. And I think that's just kind of a side effect of telling the story. I don't think that's what the directors or producers set out to do, but just the fact that it does it just by happenstance is pretty tough to watch at certain points, and I think pretty unfair to the victims. So, overall, well, I think the show did a really great job. I just can't say I agree with the idea of dramatized retellings of really horrific shit that happened, especially a serial killer that ate people. That's kind of just my opinion on the whole thing, and I really wanted to just make sure everyone had a chance to consider that when they're going in to watch the show, because I think you'll get the same story from watching a documentary. I kind of wish I had. It would have saved me a lot of time, and I like to think I'd have a more balanced, nuanced, and true opinion of things rather than this kind of I was watching actors reenact this awful thing, and I have what I perceive is Jeffrey Dahmer's behavior in my head, right? Like now I think I know what he was like, but at the end of the day, I really just watched a performance. So that's on me. I got to probably do a little more homework, go back, watch a documentary, see if I can find some interviews with him, but I really don't want to. That's kind of how disturbing this whole story is. And that's where I'm kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on this. So if it were up to me, I would say, hey, Netflix, let's pull back on these dramatized versions of horrific events. And I'm someone who's really enjoyed watching some of them on tech startups. I don't know what it is that's so mesmerizing about, you know, it must be the idea that I'm peering into conversations I didn't get to be a part of, right? Like I just recently watched the Uber one. I know I already did a podcast on the WeWork one, but I think it's the fun of this stuff kind of comes from feeling like you were there and being able to form an opinion around seeing conversations you didn't actually see, being in on meetings that you weren't a part of, you know, perceiving, body language or social cues or faces of people as they made really, really crazy decisions. And I'd say that that's definitely an appealing component of it. But I really worry when you stretch it into this realm, when you're getting involved with really, really heinous acts with, we're talking about people's lives here that were lost, that not only that, their families had to sit around and wonder for years about what happened when these people went missing. That's kind of one of the biggest things I'm taking from this is like, I mean, nowadays, 2022, we live in a world where there's not someone goes missing, you know it like almost immediately with cell phones and some of the risks that can go along with that. I start panicking if I don't hear back from somebody within a day. But back then, I don't know how people got away with just saying, "Oh no, they're just gone. They're just, we just don't know where they are. They just left town." And you just can't do that these days. So, um, you know, if you watch the show, you probably know what I'm talking about. I'll try to see if there's. Yeah, I want to talk for a second on this. Let's see. I'd say the most impactful episode for sure was episode 6, called Silenced. So one of Dahmer's victims, his name was Tony Hughes. So he was a deaf model, and it kind of goes through his story. It goes through his upbringing and his family life and how much he was able to overcome before he met Jeffrey Dahmer. So the show sort of presents Dahmer and Tony as having a like a solid consensual relationship, the closest thing to a boyfriend that Jeff ever had. I couldn't find anything that said this was the case in real life. I don't know if this was just dramatized for the series, um, but it was pretty powerful. They don't necessarily spend a ton of time on Dahmer's victims in this show. Tony was the one we got the most backstory on by far, and it hurts a lot when we see Jeffrey eventually do what Jeffrey does to all his victims, and murder him. And I think that's the same episode we see him kind of move into his cannibal side as well. So whether or not that is exactly how things went down in reality, it was an effective storytelling method. The other thing that really stuck with me was in episode 10, so the last episode of the series. They actually open with John Wayne Gacy. So if you don't know, John Wayne Gacy was just as a notorious serial killer that we know of. He killed, I believe, somewhere north of 33 boys in also the Midwest, I believe. And they kind of open the show out of nowhere. You don't really know what's going on. If you're not familiar with Gacy, you might be kind of shocked because he was, dressed up as a clown, would torture his victims, for hours and hours and hours before eventually murdering them. And then he put their corpses up in the walls on his property. So pretty crazy stuff. And they just kind of slip it in there. And again, I mean, they spare no expense when it comes to the gore and the true violence of these guys. Um, I didn't really need that. And I know they really wanted to get the story out there because apparently it was a big deal that the day John Wayne Gacy was executed was the same day that Jeffrey Dahmer received his baptism, because he sought some religious forgiveness towards the end of his life. But Jesus, man, it was hard to watch. And I don't think, while if you want to argue they took the time and gave the right attention to tell the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, I really don't think they did with Gacy. So kind of slip that in there was hard to watch, and not in a powerful way. It was kind of in a manipulative way. So look, I mean, the critical response on the show is pretty mixed. It's got a 62% on Rotten Tomatoes based on Wikipedia. I know I'm delivering the message here, but I do think that some of the criticisms of that, this is exploitation. It's queasy. It's tough. I'd say I kind of have to agree with that stuff. While I mean, nothing wrong with the actors or the directing, I just worry that if we continually pump out shows like this, we're gonna kind of see history repeat itself a little bit. We're I get we like to kind of obsess over these really horrifying stories, but I don't know, something about turning them into, media products just doesn't sit well. Um, it should really be more of a conversation about like how do we prevent this? And I hoped when I started watching the show there would be more courtroom proceedings, there would be more conversations about a psychology, and that just never really took place. But anyway, thank you guys so much for your time. If you didn't know, I've pretty much done the full launch on my YouTube, same name, Los Angeles. If you're coming from my YouTube, welcome. Hope you're enjoying this podcast. I'm going to start doing a lot more content on this front. But I hope you have a chance to check out the YouTube channel because I think there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff on there as well. Anyway, thank you guys so much for your time today. I know this was a quick one. Be on the lookout for more podcasts like this on the future. And, I don't fully recommend it because I don't want you to have to suffer the same kind of nightmares and anxieties that I've had after watching the show. But if you're interested, it is a good show. It's just tough not to feel a little sick in your stomach watching it. So that is Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix. And Los Angeles is signing out. Thanks, you guys.